in the bowels of the British Museum is one of the largest Egyptian mummy collections in the world. There are nearly 100 mummies, some over 5,000 years old. One of them has become a superstar. This is the inside story of how the British Museum resurrected an ancient Egyptian in cyberspace. It all started with a man struggling with the eternal dilemma of the Egyptologist.
Having a collection like this at your fingertips is a wonderful experience because it can tell us about life in ancient Egypt. It can be a little bit frustrating at times when you can look at a mummy from the outside, you know that it is a wealth of data about the past, but how do you extract it? Of course, we can't unwrap them. Most mummies are not just bodies wrapped up in cloth. There's a lot of other material underneath the wrappings, packing, solidified resin that kept the bandages in place. To get all that off would mean doing a lot of damage to the body, and a good deal of information would be lost irreversibly.
So how could John get under the wrappings of a mummy? He came across an American project in which scientists had resurrected a prisoner executed on death row. They had sliced up his body and rebuilt it in cyberspace. They called him the Visible Human. Perhaps this technology was the answer to John's problem. He checked the pedigrees of the mummies to pick the best candidate. His final choice was the mummy of a priest called Nesperanoob. Nesperanoob's corpse had been sealed inside a tough, body-hugging cocoon, so there was a good chance the mummy inside was completely untouched. Also, it dated to around 800 BC, a time when mummification was at its absolute best. Nesperanoob arrived in Britain in the 19th century, when ancient Egypt was all the rage.
There was a saying that if you went to Egypt, it wasn't really done to come back without a mummy under one arm and a dried crocodile under the other.
It was the in thing to have an Egyptian mummy, and there are wonderful quotes that tell us that any self-respecting gentleman should have his cupboard of curiosities. His stately home in England should be filled with these ancient mysteries and wonders.
Dead Egyptians were becoming valuable commodities.
Once it was realised that there was a trade in these things, of course, the locals were going off and digging up bodies, mummies and coffins, and they would be sold probably for a pittance to the local dealers, who then of course sell them on for much larger amounts of money to these well-heeled tourists.
When the mummies arrived in Europe, they attracted tremendous curiosity, just as they do today. In fashionable Paris or London, it was the ultimate high society event to witness a mummy being unwrapped.
People wanted to be there, tickets were sold, and in fact there's one occasion when the Archbishop of Canterbury apparently didn't get into this viewing. There was no space for him, the room was full, there's no way he could get in, but he wanted to be there, and people wanted to experience this public unwrapping of a mummy.
The unwrappers titillated their audience with the macabre thrill of human remains undisturbed for thousands of years. They dazzled them with the charm of ancient magic amulets supposed to protect the dead in the afterlife. Although mummies were precious objects of desire, they were often not treated with the respect they deserved. By the turn of the 20th century, dozens of mummies had been destroyed and lost to science. Physically unwrapping one of the museum's precious mummies was not an option for John Taylor. He was going to unwrap Nesperanoob the modern way, using virtual reality technology. The mummy was prepared for its first night out in 2,800 years. Nesperanoob had been booked in for an after-hours appointment at the local hospital. A CAT scanner sliced the mummy into 1,500 virtual cross-sections, each a millimetre thin.
Okay, so what are we seeing here?
So we're scanning from...
But what could John do with a stack of slices? He teamed up with SGI, the people who had made the visible human. They fed John's scan data into a supercomputer.
This is a tremendously powerful machine. It's used by people like NASA for doing image manipulation and the space shuttle design. It's used by car companies for doing crash analysis and things like that. So it's an amazingly powerful machine.
SGI transformed the 1,500 slices into a three-dimensional mummy that could be unwrapped digitally. John could finally see what had been hidden for nearly 3,000 years.
It was an amazing revelation. Suddenly we were seeing the whole body there in incredible clarity.
In the first hour, just immediately we were starting to see new things and things that John had never seen before, and certainly things I'd never seen before.
Everything was exactly as Nesperanoob's embalmers had left it.
Your mind is full of questions all the time. You're seeing so many things at once that you want to know, what is that? Why is that there? And you have the possibility then of zooming in straight away and looking more closely, looking from a different angle, working out what something is.
This was cutting-edge 21st century Egyptology. Without disturbing Nesperanoob's mortal remains, John could now start unlocking the secrets of this ancient Egyptian.
What I've asked Andy to do is to...
A group of forensic scientists have gathered at SGI's virtual reality centre to examine the flesh and bones of Nesperanoob. Dental expert Simon Hilson, paleopathologist Christopher Knuzel, and bioarchaeologist Margaret Judd will examine the virtual mummy to find out what killed Nesperanoob and how old he was when he died. But their first task is to check if the mummy is male or female.
The fact that it's a priest, does that mean it's definitely male?
Well, yeah, the name that we have recorded is one that's only ever used for men.
Right.
And the priestly titles are only ever held by men as well. But I personally never take these things for granted, because Egyptian mummies notoriously spring surprises on you, and even one that may be inscribed for a man has sometimes at least turned out to be a woman.
It takes the computer only seconds to strip away the bandages and lay bare Nesperanoob's remains.
Wow. Now you can really,
It shows up so clearly.
The most common way of sexing a skeleton is by looking at its pelvis.
There's that line which is the pubic symphysis, which is where the bones join at the front. It's a question of this angle underneath, the so-called subpubic angle. If it's wide open, then you reckon it's a female. If it's narrower, it's usually male.
Right.
So what do you reckon?
it looks male to me.
Me too.
Yes, it's quite narrow, isn't it?
And we would expect a more obtuse angle in the female when both pubic symphyses are joined.
Yeah, I'll go with male, I think.
By displaying the soft tissue, the sex becomes a little more obvious. No forensic skills needed here.
Yeah, I think it's a male. Yeah.
Nice. Okay.
I think it's a male. Yeah. I don't really see any counter evidence to suggest otherwise, so I'm happy with that assessment. Yeah, it looks a lot male now. Yeah. Yeah.
Nes Perenoob's skin looks remarkably well preserved for a mummy that's nearly 3,000 years old. To estimate how old Nes Perenoob was when he died, the experts check his teeth.
Yes, we're now inside the mouth. We're roughly in the position of the tongue. This is a very unusual position for me to be in. It's quite hard to see what I'm looking at. I would say it's quite clear there's a lot of wear on these teeth. That's important for the age, because the amount of wear that we're seeing at the moment for an ancient Egyptian would suggest that it's a relatively elderly individual, at least older middle age.
All the crowns seem very narrowed to me, and they don't look anatomically like a young person's teeth at all. They look really jagged, uneven.
Another way of judging the age of a skeleton is by looking at the bony deposits on the vertebrae. With the push of a button, the computer can fly into Nes Perenoob's spinal column. There are only thin deposits, not what you'd expect on an old person's spine.
It's very hard to put ages in years on these things, but I would guess it's got to be 40s or more. It's late middle age, I would think.
I agree with Simon. I think the individual's probably like 40-ish, mid-40s, but I wouldn't go too much older because you don't have a lot of other tooth loss.
Can Nes Perenoob's face confirm this? The skin of his face is well preserved, but mummification has distorted Nes's features, so it is difficult to tell what he actually looked like. To come face to face with Nes, John needs the help of facial anthropologist Caroline Wilkinson. She has reconstructed dozens of faces from skulls alone.
The skull actually gives you quite a lot of information about the small details of the face. So you might be able to see muscle attachments. You can get an indication, for example, of the shape of the nose from the nasal bones, the shape of the mouth from the teeth and how the teeth meet, the position of the eyeball in the socket from little clues around the orbit and the shape of the brow.
Usually, Caroline recreates an unknown face by sculpting its features in clay. But in Nes Perenoob's case, she can feed the data from his CT scan into her latest toy, a computer that allows her to sculpt in virtual clay.
This is basically what's called a haptic feedback tool, so it really should mirror the movements that are made by my arm, and it gives you feedback so you can feel the clay that you're sculpting on screen. It's not exactly the same, obviously, as using real clay, but it's fantastic in a different way. It makes things much easier, much quicker sometimes to alter things, whereas with clay you would have to remodel, make a muscle from scratch each time.
From a database of prefabricated features, Caroline builds up the face. The trickiest bits are the ears and the nose.
We got a little bit of information from the soft tissue that's preserved, so we knew that he had quite delicate ears. The area that we're less certain of is the very tip of the nose, because this is a very fleshy area to the face and there's no cartilage to give you an indication. And really you have to model that area in sympathy with the rest of the nose, and experience will come into play in this.
It takes Caroline 3 days to get everything in place. Finally, she pads out the muscles with fatty tissue and slips on the skin. For the first time since he was mummified, we can see the real face of Nes Perenoob. So who was this man, and where did he come from? The first clues are in the hieroglyphs on his coffin. These signs say, "The beloved of the god," meaning he was a priest who served the god Khons. And that's his name, Nes Perenoob. Nes came from a family who had been priests for many generations. His life revolved around one of the most sacred places in ancient Egypt, Karnak. This was a colossal temple complex covering an area the size of 50 football pitches within the city of Thebes. It was the religious heart of Egypt, and this is what it would have looked like in 800 BC. Nesperenub worked on the south side, in the temple of the god Khons.
Karnak was the most important temple of the city of Thebes. It was the house of the god Ammon, the chief deity of the Egyptian state. And the real purpose of the temple was to keep the universe running in order, to make sure that chaos did not overwhelm order in the cosmos.
All sorts of horrendous things would possibly happen if you didn't keep the gods happy. Famine, your crops might be trampled on by a wandering hippopotamus, your child might be stung by a scorpion and not live to tell the tale. Any sort of disease, any calamity that couldn't be explained. Why me? Why did that calamity happen to me? Ah, there must be a deity who isn't happy with my conduct.
Keeping the gods happy was the job of priests like Nesperenub.
When Nesperenub was on duty in the temple, his day would begin with a visit to the sacred lake. And he would completely immerse himself, washing himself all over with the water of the lake.
Cleanliness was essential. If a priest was unclean, he would contaminate the sanctity of the temple.
What the priests didn't know while they were entering the water of the lake was that it very probably contained parasitic worms, Bilharzia, which would have got inside their bloodstream and given them very unpleasant disease. So it may well be that the priests were actually contaminating themselves in the act of purification.
Fearing the wrath of their god, the priests left nothing to chance. Every day, Nes was shaved from top to toe to stop creatures like head lice, which were quite common in ancient Egypt, from hitching a ride into the temple. But that was not all.
He had to drink a kind of mouthwash of natron salt mixed in water. He also had to abstain from sexual contacts while he was on duty in the temple. So this was quite a rigorous regime. It would have certainly imposed a lot of restraints on his lifestyle.
Every morning, Nesperenub and his fellow priests would assemble in the courtyard and form a procession through the central aisle of the temple.
And as they walked, the temple became progressively darker. By the time the priests reached this part of the temple, they would be in almost total darkness, lit only by small torches. This was the sanctuary. This was the holiest part of the temple, and on this plinth would have stood a shrine containing the image of the god Khons.
From the hieroglyphs on Nesperenub's coffin, we can tell that he played an important role in the daily ritual. While he was putting fresh garments on the statue of the god, other priests brought in food offerings. This was the essence of the ritual, to feed the god, to keep him alive and content. It was Nesperenub's special duty to purify the offerings by sprinkling them with sacred water.
Then the image was carefully put back into its shrine, the doors were closed, and the priests would withdraw from the sanctuary, one of them using a broom to sweep away any footprints they might have left, and to leave the chamber of the god completely uncontaminated by their presence.
An inscription on the temple wall tells us that Nesperenub was no ordinary priest. He was also the fan bearer on the right hand of the king.
In Egypt, the king was divine, and any kind of physical proximity to him was clearly a major thing of status. So being a fan bearer, somebody who would stand next to the king, clearly is somebody who is in the inner circle of the pharaoh.
When the king had to make a tough decision, such as which officials to appoint to important posts, he would ask his priests for advice. Two possible answers were inscribed in stone and placed before the shrine of the god. The priests carrying the shrine would then sway from side to side, waiting for a sign.
The idea is that the image of the god is influencing the people who are holding it to come down one way or the other.
Finally, the priests would come to rest in front of one of the answers. But who was really making the decision?
If one's being cynical, one could say it's sort of these grasping priests doing whatever would benefit them best. They're probably not consciously going one way or the other, but possibly they may think actually the god is making that influence, and if it happens to fit in with what the general atmosphere of the meeting is coming up with, that's probably for them is good enough.
Egyptian priests enjoyed much political power, a big advantage in the turbulent times of Nesper-Enub.
Around 800 BC, Egypt was, if not in a mess, well on the way to getting into a mess. The glory days of when Egypt had ruled half the known world were long in the past by then.
So what had gone wrong? Egypt had never recovered from an economic collapse that had happened generations before. A rampaging tribe called the Sea People was to blame.
They moved almost like a swarm of locusts, going from their land of not very much to seeking a land of plenty. And in doing so, they turned all the countries in their path into lands of not very much. There's a wonderful letter which was found in an oven, because there's a letter on a clay tablet, which effectively says, "Send help, they're at our gates," and it's still in the oven. So clearly, that cry for help to whoever it was addressed didn't come in time.
The Egyptians eventually defeated the Sea People, but the damage was done. Egypt's economy spiraled out of control, and even by 800 BC, it had not recovered.
So it was a period of, to use the old Chinese term, it was interesting times to have been a Theban.
The virtual mummy has given us a unique insight into the life of this ancient Egyptian. But can it also tell us how he died?
Can we close up the skull completely, Andy?
How did Nesper-Enub die? So far, the forensic experts have found no clues, but they're puzzled by what looks like a small hole in his skull. Could this have been caused by a weapon?
We know that this hole doesn't go right through. There was a thin layer of bone still right across on the outside of the skull.
Externally.
Externally, yes.
Okay. If it were a traumatic injury, we'd expect to see it to perforating the entire cranial vault, and that doesn't seem to be the case in this regard. It would suggest you've got some kind of endocranial lesion.
It seems the damage came from the inside. Could this be from a brain tumor?
Normally, you'd expect to see many more lesions than this, but a single lesion like this localized really rules out a really aggressive cancerous growth. Tuberculosis is one of the diseases that can do this. It can make a cranial lesion like that. We would expect to see major joint destruction. We haven't seen any of that, so that's not consistent with tuberculosis.
Yes.
However hard they look, the experts can't pin down what killed Nesper-Enub.
Actually, much of bone diseases is something that is chronic. In other words, a person doesn't die from it, but lives with it for a period of time. And I think, again, this is one of those. It's not a cause of death. So.
I don't think you can really determine the cause of death from what we've seen, because oftentimes people will contract pneumonia, for example. It could be anything.
there is a limit to what Nesperanub's bones can tell us about his death. But no matter how he died, he would have made sure during his lifetime that his soul would never perish.
Well, the Egyptians very much believed that this world was simply a transitory thing and the permanent thing was the next world. It was important to make sure that your next world was as good as it could be.
Nesperanub almost certainly would have owned or controlled some land here at Thebes, and those resources would have been used to provide a kind of insurance policy for what happened after he died. He wanted, after all, to make sure that his body was mummified and encased in painted coffins, and that was very expensive.
It was far better to go into the next world with a nicely painted cartonnage than some grotty thing you'd bought out on the market.
Keeping the body in good shape after death was the key to immortality.
For the ancient Egyptians, the ka, that life force that was actually born with you and was there throughout your life and was an aspect of what we might refer to as spirit, it really came into its own when you died. But it needed a vessel, it needed somewhere to live. And so the body, it was believed, was necessary for this purpose.
In prehistoric times, mummies were made naturally. By lying in the sand, they would desiccate and last for eternity. The Egyptians saw this and came to the conclusion that because nature did this to bodies, bodies were supposed to be like that. Then the Egyptians stopped burying people in the sand, or at least the rich people built tombs, and then clearly observed that the bodies then decayed. They must have then inferred that there was something important about the body surviving intact, and therefore over the next few hundred years they developed the techniques of mummification.
The ancient Egyptians have left hardly any records of how mummies were actually made, so perhaps the virtual mummy can give new insights into the process.
After his death, the first thing we went to get Nesperanub to the embalmers as quickly as possible, because in Egyptian climates, things go off rather rapidly.
Decomposition starts with the internal organs, so these had to be removed first. But on Nesperanub's body, we find no obvious cuts. So how was it done? On his lower abdomen, we can see a small square of metal. This is an incision plate. It covers the only cut the embalmers ever made. The idea was to damage Nesperanub's body as little as possible and extract all his organs through a tiny incision. It was keyhole surgery in 800 BC. There's usually an eye engraved on the plate, an important symbol of healing. According to mythology, the eye of the sky god Horus was healed after being injured in battle. So by placing his image over the incision, the body was mended. After taking out the organs, the embalmers would preserve them in separate vessels called canopic jars.
Each jar had a lid that represented a god. And this is the god Imseti, who looked after the liver. This one is Hapi, who guarded the lungs. This jackal is Duamutef, who looked after the stomach. And the falcon is called Kebechsenuef, and he looked after the intestines.
No canopic jars were found with Nesperanub, so where are his inner organs? A look inside the mummy reveals a cluster of objects in his abdomen.
The surface of that mass is very folded and with bulges and creases in it. It does look like the sort of appearance you'd expect from a wrapped series of bundles. They're made out of quite high density material, and I wonder whether this is that they're impregnated with resin or something of that kind.
Nesperanub's embalmers have made sure that his vital organs will always stay with him.
The mummification process changed over time. Mummies were often transferred from one tomb to another, and if that happened and the jars were left behind, then the dead person would be lacking important parts of their body in the next life. So to make doubly certain that they had everything they needed, the major organs were put back in the body.
There was one organ the Egyptians did not bother preserving: the brain. Nesperanub's skull is empty. The ancient Egyptians had no idea of the function of the brain and saw little point in keeping it. But how could they have removed it without cutting open the skull? A closer look at the face reveals that most of the bones inside the nose are shattered. This confirms modern theories on Egyptian mummification techniques. The embalmers probably inserted a metal hook through Nesperanub's nostrils and pushed it deep into his skull.
This would have broken up the brain tissue, and after a day or so of decomposition, the body could then have been laid face down and the brain effectively drained out through the nostrils.
Once all the organs had been removed, the preservation process could begin. The bodies were left under mounds of natron salt for about 40 days.
It's very much like salting fish. It will just leach all the moisture out of the body, which, provided it doesn't get wet again, will last forever.
Finally, the embalmers covered the body in resin and wrapped it in bandages. The Egyptians believed that the resin conferred divine qualities on the deceased. Now Nesperanub's body was ready for the journey into the afterlife. Whether it actually got there depended on one vital organ: the heart.
Right, well, there's an object.
The ancient Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of the soul, so they always tried to leave it intact. But it's difficult to find the heart inside Nesperanub's mummy. Has it completely decomposed? Or could it be this shriveled object?
It's in the wrong place.
Yes.
Perhaps it could have been dislodged when they were packing the body with the other organs. It would be very easy to push the heart up.
There are certainly examples of that happening in other mummies. But would you expect the heart to shrink to that extent in mummification?
Just don't know.
Yeah, it's mainly water and blood, so a muscle, will even of the size of the heart, would shrink quite a bit, I would think. Yeah, and it might withdraw up into that area because of the strength of the aorta and so on that's attached. Yeah.
For the ancient Egyptians, the heart was the key to reaching the afterlife.
The afterlife was really this life. It was life in the Nile Valley, but everything was always fertile. Trees were dripping with dates and crops always grew well above head height. Everything was always going to be all right. But it was this world as they knew it.
However, you've got to get there, you've got to show yourself worthy. You go on a journey which passes through a number of gates. And at each gate there is a demon who's going to ask you a riddle or a question, and you've got to give the correct answer to that question. And having gone all the way through, you end up in the judgment hall of Osiris, the great god of the dead, with his sisters standing by him.
This was Judgment Day, and it was no picnic. Everything depended on your heart, which was weighed against a feather.
This feather symbolized truth and justice and order for the ancient Egyptians, this concept of ma'at. And so, as long as your heart wasn't weighed down by any crimes you might have committed, as long as it balanced with truth and justice, then you'd be okay. You'd pass on through into the afterlife. If you had done things wrong in this life and your heart did sink beneath the feather on those scales, then your heart would be gobbled up, it would be devoured by amit. The ancient Egyptian word for the gobbling one, the devouring one, a composite beast deity. The way the ancient Egyptians represented something terrifying was by creating a composite deity.
Amit has the head of a crocodile, forepart of a lion, and rear part of a hippopotamus. Its whole existence is to eat hearts and condemn the deceased to wander for eternity. Now, of course, this kind of scenario was something which the Egyptians dreaded, so they cheated. They had a thing called the Book of the Dead, and it was basically a guidebook to the next world, and it gives you the answers to all the questions you'll be asked when you go through each of the gateways.
In Nesperenub's time, the Book of the Dead had gone out of fashion, but he had other means of protection to make sure he reached the afterlife. Scattered across his body are amulets, lucky charms meant to produce a magical force field around him.
The most important of them is a thing called the heart scarab, and that is a large scarab beetle made of stone placed on the chest. And on the back of it is a chapter from the Book of the Dead, which basically says, "Oh heart, don't rat on me in the next world."
On Nesperenub's chest there is a wing-shaped amulet. It is a symbol of the sun god Ra, who brings new life. On his neck is a jed pillar. This was to give Nesperenub the strength to stand up in the world of the gods. Right next to it, he wears the Eye of Horus, a powerful symbol of divine protection. To help Nesperenub find his way around the afterlife, the embalmers replaced his eyes with a pair of magical stone eyes. Resting on the forehead is another mysterious charm. This seems to be a serpent made out of wax, placed there to keep evil spirits away from Nesperenub. There are no records about which tomb Nesperenub came from, but as we know where he lived, we have a good idea of where he would have been buried.
It was very probably in one of these tombs cut into the hillside of western Thebes. This is the place where most of the inhabitants of ancient Thebes were laid to rest.
Many of the tombs here were recycled over the centuries. Once one family had died out, their tombs would pass on to new owners.
It's very likely that Nesperenub's family would have taken over a tomb like this, probably made hundreds of years before his time. These beautiful paintings show the funeral procession with the mummy being drawn by oxen to the tomb and accompanied by a range of servants and members of the family carrying offerings of food and drink and clothing, even furniture and jewellery for the dead person. And here you can see a group of women who are part of the funeral procession. They're beating their arms and they're throwing dust on their heads. And these are traditional expressions of lamentation. Every high-ranking Egyptian would make sure that at his funeral there was a large group of people like this to draw attention to the fact that a person of high rank had died.
The most important part of a tomb was the burial chamber.
This would be located below ground level, at the bottom of a deep vertical shaft cut into the rock. And these shafts can be 10 or 20 meters deep. At the bottom would be a chamber in which there might be 2 or 3 mummies in their painted coffins. And after the burial had taken place, the shaft would be filled up to floor level with rubble to prevent anyone going back in there and robbing the bodies.
But the mummies were never safe from human greed. buried, mummies were easy prey for robbers, who sometimes broke into the tombs just hours after a funeral.
I suppose the stereotype has to be sort of a 19th century Arab furtively digging a hole in the desert and pulling out bits and pieces to sell on to the nearest dealer.
But this is not the whole story.
The greatest tomb robbers were not modern people at all, they were the ancient Egyptians themselves. And in fact, the tomb robbing in some cases even began before the funeral. We've got a couple of mummies where it's quite clear that the jewellery had been put on the bodies in the embalmer's workshop and then taken off again before the next layer of bandages were applied. There are cases where there are fingerprints clearly showing that somebody's hand had been burrowing under the bandages, pulled the various scarabs and other things out, and then hurriedly the next layer of bandages were put on. Also, even the undertakers were in on the game. We have found some burial chambers sealed shut, never touched, inside totally devastated with the mummy smashed to pieces and everything stolen.
The rewards for tomb robbing were high, but the punishment was harsh.
The point about a tomb robbery, particularly if you destroyed the mummy in doing so, was you're imperiling the afterlife of the deceased. Destroying a mummy was effectively murder for eternity. We've got quite a bit of evidence of what happens to a tomb robber because we have the court records of the trials. It looks like what was done was that a stake was driven into the ground, someone was grabbed by their arms and legs, brought over the stake, and on the count to 3, they were seeing your uncle impaled in front of your house probably might discourage you from doing the same yourself. The thing was, because of the riches involved, the stakes were very high. And of course, the more people got impaled, the higher the black market rate for gold goes, and the more lucrative if you don't get caught.
But it was not just the gold that attracted tomb robbers. The mummies themselves would have been worth a lot, especially mummies like Nesperanub with his finely decorated coffin. In Nesperanub's time, it was common practice to empty and reuse coffins, so the embalmers devised a unique way of protecting a mummy. Nesperanub is enclosed in a body-hugging inner coffin called a cartonnage. Its tough protective shell made of glue and linen kept the body safe in this world, while its magical images smoothed the transition into the next. With Nesperanub, the embalmers had good reason to want to encase the body. Resting on his head is a mysterious object. John Taylor has been puzzled by this for years. On old X-rays, this object just appeared as an opaque mass. One theory was that this was Nesperanub's own placenta. Occasionally the placenta was preserved as a symbol of rebirth.
As soon as we had access to the new imagery, we saw straight away what it was. The images were so clear. We could tell that it was actually a clay bowl sitting on the top of his skull.
But how did it get there?
We had to put ourselves into the minds of the Egyptian embalmers and what they might have been doing when this man was actually lying there in the embalming tent. We eventually came up with what we think is a plausible explanation of how it came to be there.
John believes Nesperanub's embalmers botched the job. He thinks they put a clay bowl under his head to collect excess resin and then left it there overnight. We can only imagine their horror when they turned up the next day. The resin had set hard, and their corpse had a piece of pottery stuck to his head. Just below the bowl, Nesperanub's skin looks damaged. it seems the embalmers attempted a desperate fix. But when they finally realized the bowl was there to stay, all they could do was conceal the evidence. Such mishaps may have been common in Nesperenoob's day, as by then mummification had become quite an industry. Now, after 2,800 years, the embalmer's secret is out. Nesperenoob will have a kind of afterlife that an ancient Egyptian could never have dreamt of. His mummy is the centerpiece of an exhibition that will travel the world. Thousands of people will come face to face with both the real and the virtual Nesperenoob. With the help of 3D stereoscopic technology, they will immerse themselves in the flesh and bones of this ancient Egyptian.
We are about to embark on a journey of discovery into the afterlife. You will need to think like a detective.
The idea of using technology in Egyptology is very exciting, because for many people Egyptology has dusty, old, fuddy-duddy kind of a character, when in fact this kind of project shows that Egyptology can be cutting edge.
By entering Nesperenoob's body, we have seen what was meant to be hidden from mortal eyes.
When you go under the wraps and you see this person, who is of course a human being, you're constantly aware that this is a fellow creature, this is somebody who you might recognize in the street if he lived today. But at the same time, we are not physically disturbing anything. We are not harming the chances of the afterlife that this person would have expected or hoped for.
Like every ancient Egyptian, Nesperenoob wanted to move on to a better world. Perhaps he has, and his spirit lives on.